Okay.
But Dr. Cohen, we are really thrilled at Rockford University to have you speak to our students and to the broader public that will be plugging into recorded sessions. I spent a lot of time at your Mass Avenue facility when I headed up the Korea Economic Institute of America, and groups of people from the different think tanks would all become quite known to each other. And it's always been a pleasure to visit SAIS. Dr. Cohen is the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies, what we call it SAIS, at Johns Hopkins University, former counselor of the Department of State, working for Secretary Condoleezza Rice. I think that was from 2007 to 2009. Interagency coordinator with the National Security Council, Department of Defense and Intelligence Community. He's going to be lecturing on his text for this course called the Big Stick. It's an interesting name. And welcome to Rockford University.
Well, thank you. I wish I were there in person. I'm seeing behind President Polkummer over there a picture of the campus, I assume, and it looks really nice, and it's great to see you and Professor Lee and President Polkummer. Thank you for being part of this. And it's great that we can do a visit virtually. It's never quite the same thing as being in person, as well, I know.
Did you have a few opening remarks you wanted to make, Dr. Cohen, or do you want to go to the questions, or what would you like to do? It's up to you.
I don't really have much in the way of opening remarks, because when I looked at the questions,
okay,
it seemed to me that you're going to cover cover them all. I guess the one thing I would say to the students is, of course, we're living in the middle of a really heated political moment. As of this recording, we're still not quite sure who the president's going to be. Although I think I know enough that I'd be willing to place some modest bets with some confidence. And I guess I'll say something that I say to my own students, which is, the part of what an education should allow you to do is to judge the moment that you're in with less of the passion and the heat and the distortion that those things bring. I mean, that's what an education should be. And I think on the one hand, I think it is wonderful that young people have gotten as politically engaged as they have in this election. That augurs well for the Republic, I believe. But I also would urge you to use this as an opportunity to demonstrate your ability to distance yourself from the passions of the moment and to think analytically. And that includes very much about issues of foreign policy. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. So I think with that, over to you, or Professor Lee, or whoever's going to be asking the questions, and I'll do my best.
Ron, you might want to start with the last question first.
But I moved it. Oh, the very last one, yeah.
Of course, his answer may change during the course of the class.
Dr. Cohen, it's truly a great honor. I've been following your work since probably the mid-90s. I remember you wrote a piece, it was either in the Washington Post or maybe the Wall Street Journal it was during the wars in the Balkans. And you were critical of the administration's unwillingness to call it a war and to use the word that was, what I noticed in the book, you have a discussion about the difference between calling the struggle against violent extremism war or crime. So, but I've always found everything you write clear and compelling, and so it really is a highlight of my year to have you here.
Well, thank you.
What could we expect to be different in the foreign policy of the United States under President Biden?
So if you think about a song, I think the lyrics might actually be pretty similar, but the music will just be completely different. And and in foreign policy, that can make a big difference. But let me explain what I mean by that. I think with regard to a whole bunch of issues, you won't see much change at all. Take probably the biggest one, our competition with China. I don't think the Democrats are going to be any softer on China than the Trump administration. I think, in fact, in some ways, they'll be tougher because they care about things like what's now kind of a quasi-genocidal situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or the real destruction of civil liberty in Hong Kong. But in any case, the sort of the basic geopolitics of it, pushing back on, you know, intellectual property theft and espionage, and in general, a real strategic competition in the Asia Pacific. I don't think that's going to change. If you look at the Middle East, you know, a lot of our policy is driven by what's really a major geopolitical shift, where Middle Eastern politics is not about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm not sure it ever was as much about that as people thought, but it's certainly not about that. It is very much about a kind of a geopolitical struggle with a bunch of Arab states and Israel on one side, increasingly openly, and Iran, quite likely, I would say Turkey, with Russia playing a kind of intermediate role on the other. That logic doesn't go away. So, you know, the Biden administration is not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. I don't think actually they'll be any more focused on an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement than the Trump administration. They won't have the energy for it, among other things. There will be some policy differences, but fundamentally the music is what's going to be different. So I would expect the first thing the Biden administration is going to do is embark on a kind of charm offensive with America's allies, saying the old America is back. We believe in NATO. We believe in alliances. We believe in treating our allies with respect. We're going to try to pursue multilateral courses of action wherever possible. And really, that's a return to what is quite traditional post-World War II American foreign policy. But a lot of the basics, I think, will be pretty similar. I also think a Biden administration is going to be very internally focused. You know, they're going to inherit a pandemic. They're going to inherit an economy which is under pressure. They're going to inherit a governmental system which has been pretty smashed up in some ways by a Trump administration that, you know, set aside ideological things, was just incompetent at getting political appointees of high caliber in, and that in general had kind of an animus against the civil service and established bureaucracies. They probably won't have the Senate behind them. They'll have a Democratic Party that's really internally divided between a left wing and a much more centrist wing, which don't agree on a whole lot. So they'll have their hands full domestically. And I have a theory of what I like to think of as policy physics, which is that at any given time, there's only so much energy in the political system. An administration has only so much energy that it can pour into making policy. And they will fully understand that, I believe, and they will pour that energy into dealing with a difficult domestic situation and trying to position themselves as well as possible for the 2022 midterms, and then eventually another presidential campaign in 2024. This election didn't decide a whole lot. You know, we know that we're a very evenly divided country. We know that the Republican Party is stronger than a lot of people thought. That it has a lot more appeal than people thought. A lot of the consensus about, the extent to which the Republican Party was becoming a party of old white men turns out not to be quite true. They did very well with Latinos, even grew their vote among African American males. So there's going to be a lot of internal focus. again, the good news is this will be like normal politics. This will not be people waking up in the morning and wondering what crazy or illegal thing is the president advocating on his Twitter account this morning.
So I have a follow-up. This is an easy one.
I doubt it, but
whom do you think that Joe Biden would appoint as Secretary of State? You can take a pass if you like.
So let me start with defense, which I know a little bit better. I would be surprised if it's not Michelle Flournoy, who's a very, very experienced government official. She was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. The Democrats at this point have quite a deep bench of people that they can turn to. And Michelle's a very good example. She's extremely experienced in government. She's very widely respected. On the foreign policy and national security establishments, all these folks, I mean, I'm one of them, I suppose, we all know each other, and actually we kind of get along. And the Biden team is completely normal that way. And actually most of the traditional Republican foreign policy, national security establishment, which I guess I used to be a member of while I was still a Republican, were opposed Trump on a whole bunch of grounds, including foreign policy. I think with state, there are either two possibilities. Either you go for somebody like Susan Rice, who's very prominent, but I think it's also conceivable to me that they would go for a very, very experienced diplomat who will know what you can do internationally, what you can't do when you're constrained, and who will rebuild the State Department. The State Department is actually a pretty small place. You can't do a whole lot of damage to the Defense Department. It's just so huge. State is smaller and has been more traumatized. It was more directly attacked by the Trump administration, truth to tell, with ambassadors and some senior diplomats really getting trashed. And so there, if they go down that route, rather than going for a prominent, more political kind of figure, somebody like Bill Burns, who's currently the head of the Carnegie Endowment, who was a deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration, who wrote a wonderful diplomatic memoir. If any of the students out there are interested in what is the life of a diplomat, I'd urge you to dig up William Burns, B-U-R-N-S, his memoir. I'm blocking on the title right now. It'll come back to me. Because that would be somebody who would be able not only to conduct diplomacy, but also to rebuild an institution that's going to need a bit of tender loving care. Let me just make one further point about state, because it's important, I think, for people to realize. State Department is tiny. Number of diplomats, we have foreign services, I forget what the numbers are now, it's probably about 8,000 or 9,000. And then about 40,000 plus other full-time civil servants of one kind or another. But the actual diplomatic corps is very, very small. And so that it is particularly easy to rattle it, to hollow it out. They had a lot of resignations. The other thing, though, is that unlike other departments, one of the things that's unique about the State Department is the head of the State Department, the Secretary of State, is an operator. That is to say, they are the nation's chief diplomat. They will do the business of diplomacy. It would be a little bit as if the Secretary of Defense had to walk point on patrols in Afghanistan or someplace like that. Usually the role of his cabinet secretary is to lead their departments, to manage their departments. Secretary of State has to do that, but they also actually have to be diplomats. They also have to negotiate and do all the other things that diplomats do. So it's a very challenging job, as I saw firsthand when I was the counselor working for Secretary Rice.
Wasn't Bill Burns in line to become Hillary Clinton's Secretary of State?
He was indeed. He is an enormously respected figure. He is kind of even-handed, balanced, shrewd. He's also quite courageous. This is a guy who, when an American citizen went missing in Chechnya during the Chechen revolt against the Russians, kind of went in alone and unafraid to see if he could find the guy and rescue him. Similar kinds of stories when he was stationed in the Middle East. You know, I spent most of my academic career hanging around with the American military and, you know, going out with units, and my own military service is pretty modest, but I had just a smattering. When I became counselor, I'd never really associated with the State Department a whole lot. And I came away with huge admiration because you have a lot of diplomats out there they are quite literally on the front lines. They are exposed to violence. And they can be extraordinarily courageous in doing the things that they need to do, including getting American citizens out of really tight spots. And so if any of the students here are interested in public service, as I hope and assume you are, I would urge you to think about the Foreign Service. It can be a great career and a great way to serve the country.
Dr. Cohen, can you talk a little bit more about that? Students who might be interested in pursuing a career in government or
Sure.
diplomacy, what advice would you give them? And then also, what opportunities are there at your institution?
So I was going to say, the first thing you ought to do is apply to SAIS. The website is sais-jhu.edu. So sais-jhu.edu. And that'll take you to our webpage, and you'll see it'll point you in all kinds of directions. We offer master's degrees ranging from a 64 credit degree, that's basically 2 years residential. We have mid-career degrees. We're creating a number of more specialized master's degrees. And also, I think of interest, we have one of the things that makes us unique. There are a number of things. Is we have 3 campuses, one in Washington, D.C., one in Nanjing, China, and one in Bologna. And they, you know, each offer very different kinds of experiences. But usually what our students do is they spend a year at one of those campuses and then they come to DC. We have flipped that around in coronavirus world. So we have some of the students now in DC who normally would have been in Nanjing. We couldn't get students into Nanjing, so we actually arranged for them all to go to Bologna, and we moved some of the faculty there as well. So we have what we call the Hopkins Nanjing Center in Exile in Bologna. We have classes being taught in Chinese, and they're having a wonderful time. And they're, as I told the heads of the 2 centers, what we have here is the world's 2 greatest noodle cultures coming together. You know, the Chinese insist they invented noodles, of course, Italian pasta. And it's quite wonderful. My personal advice to people is usually go out and get some work experience and some life experience before you get a graduate degree. I think our degrees are best suited for, we do take some people who are right out of college. We have had some direct admissions programs with Hopkins, for example. So with our School of Arts and Sciences, it's pretty easy to go from being an undergraduate to being at SAIS. President Fulcomer, if you want to discuss that later on with Rockford, I'd be happy to take you up on that. But in general, I tend to think that students are better off if they learn a foreign language, for one thing, and then they spend a couple of years working, preferably overseas, and have that experience of living in a foreign culture, seeing the world, including the United States, from a very different perspective than that of being in the middle of America. And there are a lot of different ways you can go from there. I think one of the things that's exciting, that I find exciting when I talk to this generation of students, is they know that they can make a contribution to the world in many ways. You know, we have some students who are going to go into public service. We have people in the military and the intelligence community and so on. But we have people who are going to go into the private sector. We have people who are going to go into non-governmental organizations or international organizations. And the truth is, you can make contributions to the private good, to the public good rather, from any of those places, including the private sector. So if you want an international dimension to your career, it's not at all difficult to do, and you'll find it extraordinarily broadening and enriching from a educational point of view. And the world needs people like that. Last thing I'll say is we were established 75 years ago in the middle of World War II, 1943, by a Republican and a Democrat, Christian Herter and Paul Nitze. And they were two relatively young men. They were in their 30s when they created the school. At the time, they didn't even know how World War II was going to end. This is before D-Day, remember. They didn't know about the atom bomb. They didn't know about the Cold War. But they could see that the United States was going to play a different role in the world. And they wanted to create a school that would prepare students for that world. And I feel that we're at a similar point now. We're much more international, of course. About 35–40% of our students are from overseas. But I also feel the world is entering a period of extraordinary change and transformation. And we're going to need lots of capable people to go out and do the work of that world in any of a number of spheres. So I think our mission has become more important than ever.
Eric, do you have a question before we turn to some questions about the book?
Sure. And Dean Cohen, it's an honor to have you with us. So thank you very much for taking time to be with us today. And I have a lot of questions for you, but I will focus on foreign policy since that's the topic of today. I want to talk about Russia for a moment. I wonder if you would talk about Russia. I'm remembering back to the 2012 election when Mitt Romney and Barack Obama were on stage together, and Mitt Romney was asked what the biggest geopolitical threat was, and he said Russia, and President Obama laughed, and the moderator kind of laughed as well, if I'm remembering it right. And so they thought it was a joke, and he was made fun of, and it turns out that they are a pretty significant geopolitical threat. I'm just wondering where you think we are today with Russia, and what you think how that might change under a President Biden.
So I have some attachment to now Senator, then Governor Romney. I actually worked on his campaign and his transition team, and at least I was told I was going to be the Deputy National Security Advisor if he won. So that was a fork in the road that never came to me. Look, I think he was absolutely right to see Russia as a major challenger to the international order. I would say that right now, from kind of a purely geopolitical point of view, China is a much bigger problem for us. I mean, there are two qualitatively different problems. I do think Russia is a huge problem for several ways. First, on the one hand, the Russian GDP is like a little bit larger than that of Italy's, but it's so it's not and they have a terrible demographic problem. You could go on about all their limitations. On the other hand, they've got a very smart military. They've got a very smart elite. Their purely military modernization is really interesting to watch. There's a lot of intellectual firepower that's gone into that. They have mastered a lot of the tools of modern conflict. And I think, we see that in their efforts to destabilize American politics. I'm not one of those who think that, 2016 happened because Vladimir Putin successfully installed Donald Trump. But I do think that they see it as being in their interest to disrupt American democracy and to discredit it, even more importantly. And what that means is that they are something of a focal point for let's call them ethno-nationalist movements, including and authoritarian movements, including in Eastern Europe, but I would add in the United States. And that does make them dangerous. It makes them quite dangerous. You know, I was struck the other day. So one of the people that President Trump apparently listens to on coronavirus is a doctor from Stanford who has no background in public health. He's a neuroradiologist. He was giving interviews on RT. RT is a Russian propaganda channel. It's very slick if you ever watch it.
I was on it.
Were you?
Yeah, I got in a big argument with the person asking the questions.
They have put a lot of money into it. It is a slick operation, and if I'm sure, Congressman, you obviously knew what you were getting yourself in for when you went on that. This guy clearly
that was before they were forced to file as a foreign agent. We all knew it at the time anyway.
Yeah, but the thing that struck me about this is this doctor shows you how very sophisticated people can be, not particularly smart. This guy clearly had no idea that what RT was, and what role he was playing in going on. You know, it's one thing if you go on to something like that or Al Jazeera and you're prepared to duke it out with the people asking you the questions, which I think is a good thing to do. But the point is that they are something of an ideological counterforce, particularly in Europe, but in some other places as well, in ways that it's harder for the Chinese to be, even though the Chinese have much greater resources. The Chinese, I think, have much greater ideological attraction, if you will, in places like Asia, which are somewhat more disciplined societies than our own, and where, you know, the case for brutal but efficient authoritarianism is a little bit more likely to play. The Russians are a different sort of threat. So I think, you know, Romney was absolutely right in seeing them as a serious problem, a serious problem. I'm not sure I completely agree with him that was the chief problem. I think the chief geopolitical problem really is China.
As a follow-up to that, since you brought up China, and I know you talk about this in your book, and full disclosure, I haven't read your book in its entirety, but
you know, as an author, all I care about is whether you bought it. That's all.
But I got it from the library. No, I'm just kidding. But you talk about China quite a bit, and you know, one of the things that struck me, and I'm sure this is true, but there's a reference in there to there's no guarantee that if we get into a war with China that we would win, and I think that's a scary proposition. It could, because you talk about war maybe happening unintentionally or escalating out of a situation that we didn't anticipate. So I don't know if you could say something about that.
Yeah, so there was I think one of the scariest public documents I've read recently. There's you know, there are some bipartisan things in Washington, D.C. People don't always believe that, but it's true. One is there's a bipartisan defense policy commission where the Republicans and the Democrats each pick a set of co-chairs. And the idea is that they're supposed to review the national defense strategy that's been produced by the administration. So this last one was co-chaired. I'm delighted. It was entirely a Hopkins operation. The co-chairs were on the Democratic side, retired Admiral Gary Roughead, former chief of naval operations, who is a trustee of Johns Hopkins University and is affiliated with our applied physics lab. And on the Republican side, my good friend, Ambassador Eric Edelman, who's actually at SAIS as a distinguished practitioner in residence. And I counted up their senior staff, and they were half Hopkins. So it was an entirely in-house product. But the thing that was scary about it was they say, we are not confident that we would prevail in, say, you know, big fight over Taiwan. And, you know, that is not where we were. I remember, you know, I've served on various advisory boards in government over the course of time. And probably about 20 years ago or so, I was on a high-level panel in the intelligence community, and you were just beginning to get briefings on Chinese military modernization, and everybody was just completely dismissive of the ability of the Chinese to modernize their military in a way that could ever compete with us. And I think that complacency is finally gone. The partly because of the spectacular growth in the Chinese economy, but also because, again, you're dealing with an extremely sophisticated civilization and extremely sophisticated military thinkers and a technology base that is not as good as the American, but it's not that far off. And there's no question that conflict in the Western Pacific could be very, very difficult for us. And it's also the case, as you alluded to in your remarks, that wars don't always happen just because you want them to happen. Sometimes they happen because you get one stupid thing after another. And we've recently commemorated the end of World War I, and that war should teach us that lesson, that wasn't a war that anybody in particular was planning for 1914, and people kind of walked into it, and with catastrophic results. So yeah, I think it's something to be quite sober about.
Thank you.
What should U.S. policy toward China be? And of course, we all want to avoid war. So how do we avoid war without America losing its kind of the role in the world that you see it needs to continue to hold?
Well, that is the great geopolitical challenge, and as you know, there's a whole chapter in the book about that, because I think China is it's really a separable issue. I think this is why you really do need a pretty subtle and sophisticated set of policies, because this isn't going to be all about confrontation or all about accommodation. It's going to be a very complicated mixture of both. And there's going to have to be a very large military element, to be sure. So, I'm all in favor, for example, of a naval buildup. On the other hand, China is going to be our largest, well, it's in some ways our largest trading partner, but we're going to have deep economic ties to China, no matter what. We have populations of Chinese Americans we have to be thinking about and be mindful of. And the truth is, a prosperous and free China is in everybody's interest. A prosperous and unfree China is a serious problem. And a prosperous, unfree, and kind of nationalistically aggressive China is a really serious problem. And I think that part of the problem is that's what we're now seeing. Seems to me what a lot of the analysis of China did not pay sufficient attention to is the way in which Xi Jinping is a different kind of Chinese leader. Undoubtedly the one with the greatest grip on power since Deng Xiaoping, maybe since Mao Zedong. Someone who clearly has a vision of Chinese power which goes, I think, even beyond where his predecessors were, and they were not a bunch of pacifists. And somebody who feels that the time has come where the gloves can come off, the mask can come off, and so you see the kinds of things we've seen in Hong Kong. So we're in a dangerous period now. What qualifies that a little bit is, which makes this period both more dangerous, but means it'll come to an end. The Chinese, as far as we know, also believe that they're operating with a window that will close. Their population is aging much faster than the American population. It's shrinking as a result of the one-child policy. Vast ecological damage. It's a country with 14 other countries on its periphery, most of which are not friendly or have some serious reservations or disputes. So the problem is that they look at all that and they do see that they've got a window to do what they want to do, a decade and a half. And so this is going to be a fraught period. I think the most important thing we can do is, once again, I'd fall back on alliances. There's something called the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. We can make that much stronger. I think those our three partner countries are interested in that. The more we build a coalition of countries that on the one hand want to trade with China, want good relations with China, but are also not going to accept Chinese aggression, the better off we're going to be. And it's again, one of the reasons why it seems to me a Biden administration will do better on China is just because their instinctive approach to alliances are that alliances are a good thing. Whereas, I genuinely believe, and this was even reported, that the current president literally does not understand why you'd want alliances.
Don, do you want to have the next question?
Well, I had the pleasure of visiting Johns Hopkins University in Nanjing. When I actually led the largest delegation of members of Congress there when I chaired the U.S.-China Interparliamentary Exchange, and it was extraordinary because Congressman Bill Pascrell from New Jersey got in a huge fight with Bernie Sanders. But it was I think there were about 200 students. Half were American, half were Chinese. This was around 2005. And what we noticed back then, I think that Chiang Zemin was the president, there was the beginning of an openness on the part of the students to ask questions such as, do you think China is ready for democracy? And some of the people, experts on China with us, said that was an extraordinary fact that the student was able to ask that question. So I would really commend that Nanjing experience to the students now in exile.
Well, first, I'm delighted that you were there. And I think that's part of the tragedy. I think for many people at exactly that time, there was the sense that China was opening up. Faculty could say things, students could say things that would be, frankly, would be a lot more difficult now. I mean, there's been a degree of internal crackdown to include surveillance and things of that nature, which I think is tamping down free speech. I don't know. I don't think that lasts forever, because I don't think the younger generation of Chinese is much more sophisticated. Many of them are now studying in the United States. And I think the Chinese leadership may be aware of that. They may know that, that the current style of authoritarianism will only go so far. The one downside, though, is, and I think this was something you'd wanted to talk about later on, of our handling, or if you prefer, mishandling of the coronavirus crisis, and then our prolonged internal political difficulties, I think have damaged us. So much of the power of the United States is the power of our example. That's part of what the Nanjing Center is. We have the only OpenStax library in China. Okay, no censorship of what books you can read in that library. When people look at the United States and say, wow, you've had almost 250,000 dead. You've had these repeated surges. And China, with rather quite brutal means, and after having an initial botch of handling it in Wuhan, was able to suppress it. People say, we're not sure we want that. Now, there are plenty of other democratic examples where you can say, well, okay, look at Australia, look at New Zealand, look at South Korea, all of which have done a much better job of managing coronavirus than we do. But everybody looks at the United States. I think it's hard to convey to American students sometimes just how much people pay attention to us. I mean, isn't it amazing? Say you have the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, the killing of George Floyd. All of a sudden, you're having demonstrations in Europe. Well, why? Well, it's partly because they have their own racial issues, which don't frequently get brought to the surface in the same way that they get brought to the surface here. But it's also because people expect something of the United States. And because people do ascribe a kind of universal significance to a country that was founded as a universal kind of nation. You know, I always remind people, go back to the Gettysburg Address. What Lincoln is telling people is this is not about whether the United States, as a single country is going to come together. It's about whether any nation so constituted can long endure. And we still have that larger significance. So what we do really, and even how we conduct ourselves at home, really, really matters around the world. The last thing I'll say, just because I feel I should put in a plug for the Nanjing Center, this is also why I think it's important that even as we be careful about things like espionage, which genuinely happens on American university campuses and others, it's also important to maintain pretty close academic ties on top of the commercial ties. We want American diplomats who are fluent in Chinese. We want American business people who are fluent in Chinese. We want American academics who are fluent in Chinese. I'm very proud of the fact the Consul General in Shanghai, which is the second most important diplomatic position in China, is a graduate of the Nanjing Center. So for all that, as you can tell, I'm quite wary of China as a great power. I also want us to be deeply engaged with it. And I think it's essential that we be engaged with it.
Dr. Cohen, you chose the title, The Big Stick,
Yeah.
and you open with a discussion of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
How would you respond to maybe critics on the left who would say that what you're calling for is really kind of an American imperialism? And that's a criticism that was leveled against, or has been against, Teddy Roosevelt. So help us understand how we what we're to make of the call for American leadership, including moral leadership that doesn't become American dominance and exploitation of the world.
So, actually, you could do a lot worse than to study the career of Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, I'm working on a book about Teddy Roosevelt in the world. He, he's very famous for the kind of pugnacious kinds of statements. Actually, speak softly but carry a big stick. The emphasis was on the speak softly part. He was in the conduct of international affairs. He did not believe in bluffing. He didn't believe in threatening. He wanted a strong United States, and he wanted everybody to know that the United States was strong, which is why he's one of the architects of the modern United States Navy. And also, people don't realize this quite as much, the modernization of the United States Army. But he saw the United States as being required to obviously protect its own interests, but to play an important role in maintaining global order. And I think he is the first American president who saw that the United States would not merely be globally engaged, but would have a global role. Let me just explain the difference for a moment. The United States has always been globally engaged. People think, we suddenly burst upon the world in 1941. That's not true in the slightest. As I like to tell students, there wasn't a what you think of World War I and World War II are more like World Wars 8 and 9. I mean, there were a whole series of global conflicts waged from the end of the 17th century through 1945 between Britain and France, and North America was involved in each and every one of them, and we even triggered 2 of them. American commerce was international throughout our history. The United States was deploying force internationally throughout our history. The first thing we do after the War of 1812 is send the entire United States Navy off to go beat up on North African pirate states. So we've always been engaged, but Roosevelt was the first one who thought the United States would have a global role to play in a world that he thought was getting increasingly precarious. And I think his reading of European politics in particular was very accurate. The other thing to remember about Teddy Roosevelt, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. People forget that. He won, and the reason why he won the Nobel Peace Prize is he's the one who arbitrated the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War, which was a terrible, bloody conflict, was arbitrated at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, by President Roosevelt. So he was also very much a peacemaker as well. And I think there's a lot to be learned from his actual conduct of foreign affairs. I mean, he's an endlessly fascinating man because there's so many tensions and contradictions in him. But that just, in some ways, I think that makes him more interesting and even a better model, because sometimes you got to be one and sometimes you got to be the other.
Just a side note, Rockford University, its most famous alum is Jane Addams, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh, really? Come on,
Yeah.
congratulations. That's great.
So, what would you say to those people who would, again, those critics who would say, why should the United States be the guarantor of order in the world? Why shouldn't that be a shared responsibility?
Well, it was always a shared responsibility. You know, the idea that the United States was this kind of single sheriff policing the world isn't true. I mean, we played a particularly outsized role in the period immediately after World War II, when the United States had over 50% of the world's GDP, because European economies have been flattened. But you know, the thing that is so distinguishing about the American role in the world is, particularly in that formative period, from actually World War II itself to 1949, 1950, is it was built on multilateralism. And this is why I think that critics of, right-wing critics of the United Nations, for example, they're dead wrong. The whole point is that the UN was founded in San Francisco, no coincidence, in 1945. And the United States was going to lead the way, but other nations were going to be involved. Or the International Economic Order, founded at Bretton Woods in 1944. Or the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in Washington in 1949. All these are happening in the United States. They are all multinational, multilateral solutions to international problems. I can tell you from my own several years as a diplomat working in the State Department, the first question everybody asks is, what are you going to do, you Americans? I mean, I remember this was, of course, during the Iraq War. You know, I was called into one, I think it was the German ambassador's residence. He gave me a lovely lunch, a very gracious man. It was a lovely lunch, but he spent most of the lunch beating us up about Iraq. And then we moved on to some other things. He said, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I said, Ambassador, you know, you've just spent the previous 45 minutes telling us we're a bunch of idiots for how we've handled Iraq. Why would you want us to do anything? He said, because you're the only ones who really matter. And that remains the truth. And I would add to that, and I make this case in the book. First, let's understand the United States has benefited a great deal from the world order that we helped build. You know, and if it goes away, you'll realize it was a pretty good deal. Yes, we spend disproportionately more on defense. Okay, we've got troops stationed in Europe, South Korea, places like that. Fine. If you look at the benefits we get in terms of, say, our influence over the international financial system, or simply how we have benefited from a regime of free trade around the world, you'd say, as a deal, it's really worth it. The other thing is, what's the alternative? The alternative is not, there isn't an alternative. China's not going to do it. They have no interest. They don't have the capacity. something called the global community, it doesn't exist. It's a bunch of sovereign states acting in their individual interests. The United Nations is a place. It's not a thing, really. And the alternative is going to be a world in which you have a completely self-help regime. I just had published in Foreign Affairs, they asked me to do an article on what does the world look like if Trump wins? And I said, because of America First and the disdain for alliances, it becomes a self-help world. In a self-help world, everybody gets nuclear weapons as quickly as they can. Everybody is willing to use whatever means necessary, including assassination, targeted biological weapons, which are quite conceivable, in order to protect themselves. It gets ugly really, really quickly. And we shouldn't think that the ugliness stays away from our shores. We already know, I mean, foreign governments do try to interfere in our politics. Whatever it would be a lot worse than that. I mean, we're not an island. We are the most powerful, and we don't have a whole lot of choice. We can do this well, or we can do this badly. And that's actually, the point is, that's actually what Teddy Roosevelt said. I'm quoting from a speech he gave just before he became president. And he said, basically, it's a speech he gave in the middle of the country, quite deliberately, I think, to a bunch of farmers. And he's saying, we don't actually have a choice. We'll either do this well, or we'll do this badly. But we're going to find ourselves playing that role. And Winston Churchill said a similar thing during World War II when he spoke at Harvard commencement in 1943, saying, either you guys take a lead or it's going to be chaos.
Somebody has to lead.
It's true in any walk of life, I think. I mean, even universities, I dare say, President Fulcomer, I mean, I just look at it from the point of view of a dean. I'm not up there with a president of a university, but president's got to lead. Somebody's going to lead, because it's not going to happen spontaneously. I don't know, maybe Rockford is different.
Eric, do you want to ask a question?
Well, you referenced the Iraq War in your conversation with the German ambassador, and in your book you talk about that you think in retrospect the war was a mistake, yet it was inevitable that something was going to happen. So what do you think, now with hindsight and 20 some years beyond that, or not 20 some, but quite a few years after that, what do you think we should have done?
Boy, I'm just going to get some tea here. To really deal with it, I probably should have something stronger. That is a really tough question. So the first thing I'd say, particularly for the benefit of the students, is, and this can be something that is very, it's very difficult to appreciate sitting on your sofa, reading the newspaper or reading a book. When you're actually in government, you're operating in this fog, and you don't know whether the decision is a good one or a bad one. You really don't. And particularly decisions that bubble up to the presidential level are 51, I would say 51, 49 kinds of decisions. And sometimes they're 50.1, 49.9. I mean, you just can't be sure. All the choices look terrible. Some look awful, and your job is to pick awful over terrible, to try to figure out which is which. And I think Iraq is like that. So the first thing is, we all should beware of the dangers of hindsight, because in hindsight, we know what happened. Secondly, I think we have to remember the importance of contingency. One way you can read history is as though this were kind of a tape that was just being unrolled, and it was all preordained, when in fact, I think a deep understanding of history teaches us there's a lot of contingency. There are a lot of decisions being made at different points along the way, a lot of different paths that you might have gone down that you didn't go down. And so, I do say in the book that the war, which I had supported, was a mistake. That doesn't mean it had to be anything like what it was. And the third thing I would say, and it's all by way of windup, is remember, we're not the only actors. This is a particular conceit Americans have, thinking that we're the only ones making decisions. The other side's making decisions too. Friends and neutrals are making decisions too. So it's a complicated business. I think with Iraq, the future historians are going to look at this, I think, from a much bigger picture. They're going to sort of look at, first, to the extent they look at the history of the Persian Gulf, they'll say the Iraq problem really originates in the Iranian Revolution. Because after the British withdrew from that part of the world, the United States sort of takes its place. The United States is not willing to commit substantial forces to that part of the world. And so it relies on two pillars, really. One is Iran and one is Saudi Arabia. The Iranian Revolution happens. The Iran pillar dissolves, and it's replaced by a revolutionary Islamic regime. And there is a power vacuum because the Saudis don't actually have the heft to be able to balance that. And you have the rise of Saddam Hussein and Iraq, and which was in some ways the most effective state in the Arab world, arguably. And that in turn was, in a whole bunch of ways, led to a series of crises, including the Iran-Iraq War, which eventually leads to the invasion of Kuwait, which in turn leads to American involvement in the first Gulf War. I think the first big mistake you can really point to in all that was the failure in the 1991 war not to insist on the removal of Saddam Hussein. Now, again, I was not in favor of that at the time. I only know this in retrospect, so I'm not pretending that I knew it all along. I didn't. But in retrospect, we should not have been willing to deal with the Iraqi regime unless Saddam were removed. What we ended up with was a situation where you're going to have American forces permanently deployed in that part of the world. You had to do more and more things to contain an Iraq that was trying to come back. And there was, you were maintaining a sanctions regime and an inspection regime, which were extremely unpopular in the Arab world. People forget when Osama bin Laden issued his first fatwa against the United States, at the top of the list of arguments that he's making, it's about Iraqi children suffering from sanctions. I mean, this was a huge deal. And in 2003, what you had happen was that the inspections regime had collapsed. The sanctions regime was collapsing, and leaders were looking at an Iraq that they thought could come back, except this time with nuclear weapons. Now, in retrospect, we realize the nuclear program was defunct. We didn't know that. Shame on us. Turns out Saddam Hussein didn't know that either. He thought he still had a functioning program. So that was the first mistake. I would say the second mistake, and this is the one I fault myself for most, is that once the decision was made to invade Iraq, which was actually argued for by a much wider range of people than that is now often remembered, there was way too little attention given to what the follow-through was going to be. And in particular, this is one where I do think the United States military has to look itself in the mirror, because they had no desire whatsoever to think about the problems of military governance and stabilization. And I would argue we were profoundly unserious about how we approached it. I think another big turning point was simply our failure to understand what the nature of the conflict was. As late as 2006, we're still talking about bitter enders and former regime elements and things of that kind, when what you're actually beginning to see is an internal religious civil war between Sunni and Shia Arabs with lots and lots of complexity, and we just happen to be in the middle of it. I could go on. I would say, though, and people sometimes, again, people tend to forget this, by the end of the Bush administration, Iraq was actually in pretty good shape, all things considered. I mean, I traveled back and forth to Iraq quite a bit when I was working on the Defense Policy Board and then as counselor. By 2008, Baghdad was actually doing pretty well. And indeed, the Obama administration, when they came in, thought things were going quite well. And you can find quotes from the man who may very well be our next president affirming that. And I think we made a mistake there too, which was to kind of claim premature victory, which meant that we ended up in a third Iraq war, which was the war with ISIS. So I mean, it's a pretty sad story, but, and also something I have to say I say in the book, everybody has to remember that you know the history that happened, you don't know the history that didn't happen. We don't know what the world would have been like if Saddam had been able to escape both sanctions and inspections. We know there was certainly the will to restart a nuclear program. We know for sure they had a covert biological weapons program. We found that out in 1995, actually, well after the first Gulf War. What would the world have been like with a Saddam Hussein who'd been restored to power, who was able to export oil again, had those kinds of revenues, and had a lot of vengeance in his heart? We don't know. We don't know what the results would have been if we had been just a lot better at handling the challenge that was Iraq. We don't know. But that said, it was a mistake, and we've paid for it quite a bit. Others have paid even more, as is often the case.
Joe Biden, I recall this. I was in the House and he was in the Senate, and sometimes people listen to each other, and Joe was never known as being very heavy on international affairs, but he always had an opinion, and was always a fun guy to be around. But I recall quite distinctly, he said the solution to the Iraq issue is to go back to the original tribal divisions, as opposed to political lines drawn after World War I, and allow the Sunnis to have their own areas, the Shias and the Kurds, and to have a confederation with an agreement on how to share the oil revenue. And I thought, how you remember things, of all the things that were said when I was in the House. Of course, I sat on the Foreign Relations Committee. I thought that was very creative, and I think showed an intense emphasis upon history.
Yeah, I guess the problem is, although we Americans are now involved in tribal politics, so we may understand tribes better than we once did. Iraqi tribal organization was a lot more complicated than people realize. There were some tribes that were half Shia and half Sunni.
Right.
There are a lot of tribes, and they were interpenetrated, and the different religious groups were frequently interpenetrated. They actually were not killing each other all the time. That was not the history of, that wasn't the history of Iraq at all. But the more important thing, I think, and this is a challenge for us in understanding other societies. Tribal identity matters to people at different times in different ways. If, God forbid, the city in which you live became completely anarchic, with armed mobs and car bombs going off, My guess is, what would you do? Well, you'd rally around the church that you go to, or the synagogue, or the mosque, and those would be the people that you really cling to. Or, for all I know, it might be your bowling league or something like that, some kind of primal organization where you feel, okay, this group of people, at least I may not like all of them, but I can really trust them because these are my kith and kin. And that's sort of what you saw happening a lot in Iraq. The tribal identities became more important. Normally, when you have modernization, people move to cities, the tribal identities become a lot weaker. They're living in a big city, they're mixing with lots of different kinds of people. They don't need the support that tribes can provide. So I think the mistake we sometimes make is we think we don't realize how much societies change and evolve over time, including our own, by the way. And that was very much the case with Iraq. It's one of the sources, I think, of the original mistakes is the image that Bush administration decision makers had of Iraq was of a very sophisticated, secular, highly educated society. That was a true picture of Iraq in the 60s and 70s. For a whole bunch of historical reasons, Iraq had very high levels of education, and it really was quite secular. It was really easy to get alcohol, for example, in Iraq. It was only during the Iran-Iraq War that Saddam Hussein had an inscription from the Quran put on the Iraqi flag. I mean, he was using religion for his purpose. Well, that image of Iraq was correct, but what people I know and the intelligence community, I think, didn't fully appreciate is you had the Saddam's regime, which was brutal enough. You had the fearsome bloodletting of the Iran-Iraq War. You had then the crushing defeat of the first Gulf War. You had then the real suffering that was inflicted by sanctions, plus more repression by Saddam, which included massacres of Shia and Kurds. And the result is that it was a much more kind of smashed up kind of society than we realized. I mean, one of the ways in which the planning for the occupation went awry is we just assumed that there'd be much more of an effective civilian bureaucracy to actually run the place with, some either some politicians or, some really relatively modernized kind of general running things. That just turned out not to be true at all. It was a picture of the society that was accurate, but unfortunately was about 25 years out of date. And one of the reasons for that, in turn, was, we were listening to a lot of quite sophisticated Iraqi emigres, but who hadn't been in their own country for a quarter century.
Dr. Cohen, we're about out of time. We appreciate it's gone fast. I know, we appreciate your taking the time to be with us. Earlier you opened with a call for students to think dispassionately about our situation today. I wonder, as a fellow lover of Thucydides, if you could just say maybe what's something we can learn from that old historian about that would help us understand our situation today?
Well, I think Thucydides, think about Thucydides the patriot. Thucydides loved his city, Athens. And you see in some of Pericles' great speeches, the great Athenian leader, his love of the city and his love of its openness, of its public spiritedness, of its freedom. But Thucydides also saw what the threats were to Athens' ability to survive as an inspiring and free kind of society. And he's very good at describing social breakdown. He describes it first in the plague that strikes Athens, which was a real plague, but it's also a metaphorical plague. And then in Civil War, the rise of demagogues, Cleon, who was actually a personal opponent of his. And of course, Thucydides himself is eventually exiled from Athens. And so I think the thing to take away from that ancient historian is to know that you can both love your country and love the things that make it great. And you can be completely dispassionate about understanding the things that are going wrong. Now, the Greeks invented tragedy. Americans don't do tragedy so well. It's not in our nature. We are by nature, we are a forward-looking and optimistic people. And I hope in that way, we don't want to be quite like Thucydides. We want to have that dispassionate understanding. We want to have that, that love of something that's worth admiring. But then I think, and this is really a challenge to a younger generation, to have the will and the courage to go out and try to do something to make it better and to preserve the things that we want to preserve.
Dr. Cohen, the Rockford University is a tiny university, but what they have done is something on the order of what Professor Gil Rosman has done. And you know Gil, I'm sure, who is a sociologist and an expert on international affairs and et cetera. The department that Dr. Lee heads up is political science, criminal justice, and sociology. And then Dr. Catherine Forsland heads up, it's called history and international studies. So there's an integrated approach to the whole area of international relations and history, political science, that brings in the sociological aspect of looking at the world, not through the eyes of an economist or military leader or politician, but through the eyes of the people. And we have big, wide arms, a virtual invitation for you to come and spend some quality time with Eric Fulcomer. Eric, did you want to follow up on that?
Well, I would just echo that you're welcome anytime to visit Rockford. This is the campus behind me. It's not a picture from today, although it's a beautiful day in Rockford, as it usually is. But the grass is not quite as green today. But you're very welcome to join us, and I look forward to talking with you further about the possibility of some type of partnership that you referenced at the beginning of your talk. And so maybe the next time I'm in Washington, D.C., I'll stop by and see if I can connect.
Well, I will say you have a standing invitation. Actually, all three of you do. And I'd like to explore that, but I'd also just like to say that I would, I suspect that I would really enjoy a visit. So let me take that as a commitment, if I may.
Excellent.
Thank you
Sounds
so
good.
much. Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.